Hey everyone, and welcome to Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. My guest today is Caleb Henry, the Director of Research at Quilty Space, a subscription-based business intelligence platform for the space industry. This is actually Caleb's second appearance on Pathfinder, and I brought him on so we could riff on a number of new developments in the industry. But before we get into the conversation today, a quick word from our sponsors. SpiderOak's Orbit Secure software is designed for hybrid space operators struggling to manage the chaos of securing data flow and access to and from tens of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit. Using a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, Orbit Secure allows your mission to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure hybrid space environments. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. Caleb, welcome back on the show.
It's good to be here.
So I want to give the listeners some context on your return. So Caleb and I are part of a group of folks aiding the White House OSTP on baselining the size of the space economy. And Caleb was actually one of the most insightful folks in the room. So it made sense for me to grab him back on the show to chat through some of the views he was sharing that day. Now, we can't get into all of that in terms of specifics, but I think there's a lot of things that we can cover. So needless to say, Caleb, it's glad to have you here back.
Yeah, it's good to be here. That was a fun time and just kind of flew by. It's always fun to talk space with space people. Or not
for sure.
People.
So, yeah, exactly. So I want to start, you have a very interesting background, right? You spent time as a journalist, so you definitely get our business here at Payload. But I want to start there, maybe talk a little bit about, your time as a journalist. You were at Space News. How was it working in the industry back then? And then what ended up becoming, your transition over to Quilty. So why don't we start there?
Yeah, I am really grateful for the time that I got to spend in the world of journalism. Something that, I started writing started writing full time in 2013. I wrote a little bit in college before that, but not with like big publications or anything. Not that trade publications are huge, but anyway, I digress. I got my start in 2013 writing full time, and the things that I really appreciated were, so I wrote for two publications. One was via satellite, and the other Space News. Via satellite really gave me more of like the end user perspective. I would say while I was there, it was a publication in the middle of an evolution. The name was actually a play off of the origin of the publication. It was everything that was shared via satellite. So it was a lot of talking to television broadcasters and internet service providers and anybody who made use of satellite capacity or satellite services, bought satellite dishes and antennas and things like that. And then when I transitioned from there over to Space News, that was a lot more of the upstream, people who are flying the satellites, who are building the rockets, building the spacecraft, all of those things. And it was really neat for me to come from the end user side first. I think that was the harder side to understand. Like, those are not space people. They just care about the services at the end of the day. And then to kind of see both sides of the coin was nice. So it helped me get a really comprehensive view of the industry.
And what ultimately prompted your decision to leave journalism and pursue research?
Yeah, so that's a question I get pretty often. And I still haven't figured out how to make that succinct. But I'll say probably the most clear sign for me, or like the most clear reason for me, was really I had asked myself at probably going even further back. So journalism is a learning curve. You're learning every day. You're talking to new people all the time. And then you get the privilege of sharing that information with your readers, with other people. And it was such a steep learning curve for the first 3 years, especially 3 or 4 years. After that, it's not that I like plateaued. There was still tons to learn, but I felt like I had kind of hit a groove. And so I asked myself, all right, do I want to stick with this and stick with what's comfortable and feel what it feels like to be good at something? Or do I want to try and do something new and try something different and maybe gain some new skills? And so I said, at 5 years, we're going to make this decision. And 5 years turned into six, six turned into seven. So again, it wasn't for a lack of love of what I was doing, but really a feeling that it was the right time to go and try something new and learn new skills. However, I also wanted to maintain some of the things that I found fundamentally important and valuable from my time as a journalist. I really liked the global nature of the space industry from the beat that I had, which was mainly satellite communications. The Both publications had a pretty large international readership, but especially at Via Satellite, more of our readership was outside the U.S. than inside. And so I just really enjoyed that international dynamic. I really like being a neutral voice in the industry. And I like getting to talk to as wide a range of participants in the space sector, whether that's operators of satellites or builders of rocket engines or somebody who has created the software to string a bunch of gateways together around the world, whatever it is. uh, I didn't want to shrink that at all. I wanted to
Sure.
have as much exposure to the space sector as possible.
Right.
And that's what led me to kind of a specialized boutique research firm, which is Quilty Space.
Yep. Well, so let's talk about Quilty for just a second. What is Quilty? What do you guys do?
Yeah, so Quilty is a specialized research and advisory firm. There's three things that we do. The first is where I am, where there's the research side. So I help write reports, and actually, it might even be useful for me to step back even. Before me, the company was formed about 7 years ago by two former Raymond James employees. One was on the research side, that's Chris Quilty, and the other was on the investment banking side, that's Justin Cadman. So they pulled together a shop that was very much focused on the financial aspects of the space industry. So our research differs from other researchers, for lack of a better word, in that we have this deep financial focus. A lot of our research is actually based on financial models that are built for the companies that we cover, and some of the companies that we've found sufficiently interesting, or our customers have a deep interest in, and so we will actually build
Hmm.
financial models for them. And we would do everything shy of a buy sell rating in our research, so you get a really deep understanding of these specific players in the space sector. So that's the research side where I am. We also do kind of deep dives into various tech trends or recent developments in the industry. There's an investment banking business which helps with buying and selling companies. I'm not involved there, but that side of the house has been very busy. I want to say they've sold about a half a dozen companies over the past 12 to 18 months.
Hmm.
And trying to think, like Zen Technologies was sold to Voyager, Hawaii Pacific Teleport got sold. There's a couple others that I should have memorized. I should have flashcards, but that's those guys. They do that, and then the third thing that we do on occasion is some consulting work. So that wasn't really part of the main vision of the company, but people actually ended up coming to us for it, and so we work with those companies to try and help them understand the space industry, or maybe just a part of the space industry if they're in it, or if they're trying to get in it. And I have also found that to be pretty rewarding. I think one thing that was unexpected was just the number of non-space companies that have come to us to inquire about and learn about the sector and figure out if they should have a role in it.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're gonna have to come back to that. That's a super interesting point. So, I want to talk. So as far as the research is concerned, so starting Quilty 7 years ago, I think that's obviously a lot of foresight and look through into the future. I was still a banker at that time, and one of my frustrations was that there was not any sell side research there's not really sell side research in the space industry. So no one was really putting that buy sell rating on space companies, but also made sense why there weren't many space companies that were public, right? So it didn't really make sense for an investment banking team to be covering space companies. Now a lot of that has changed. A lot of the major investment banking groups on the research side are covering space or starting to launch space coverage areas, and all of that has changed. I am curious, as you think about not being part of a bank, right? So as an independent organization, how are you thinking about where you're like what are you covering? Is it dictated by the clients? Is it dictated internally by a view around the industry and what's important? How are you deciding the companies and the areas of the market that you should be covering and focused on?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when Quilty Space started, the company's 7 years old. I've been here for 3 years. It started with a customer base that was, I think, like almost entirely the financial sector, and over time has grown to include uh, a much larger portion of the space industry as well, and then even a sliver of government customers that have come to us. So our research, a lot of it was started at that beginning with looking at what were the publicly traded companies that were trackable and observable at the time. And even that has shifted, right? So companies like Intelsat are no longer uh, trading on the stock market, but our coverage has changed to, I'd say, reflect where people are interested while also keeping our core expertise. So a lot of our research is on satellite communications operators. A large amount of it is also on remote sensing. So now that there are so many more publicly traded remote sensing companies, we've actually spent a decent portion of this year building financial models for companies like Planet and Black Sky and Satellogic to try to get a deeper understanding of the trajectory of their business. And of course, all those go public, and then Maxar, the giant, goes private. So that one kind of shifts out of view. You kind of have to use some of the historical knowledge that you have there to help influence research going forward. But it's a mix of what people are asking us for, what is actually available that we can study and monitor, and frankly, what we think is interesting. So sometimes we'll just stop and go, "Hey, this is a really cool development, and we think people will also find this interesting." So we'll go and try to spend some time and write about it. And I think most of the time we're right.
Yeah. All right. Well, all right. Let's dive into some of those areas. So I want to start with an area that you didn't mention, but does I know directly play into everything that you do and spend time on, which is launch. And I know
Yeah.
again, it's not Quilty's stated area of expertise, but I certainly expect that you probably have some interesting views around that area of the market. So let's just start in launch.
Yeah. A
Let's
couple.
talk. Yeah, let's start with SpaceX, which is a company most of our listeners have heard of. But the reason why I want to start with SpaceX is because when we chatted last week at this in this group setting, SpaceX came up a number of times, and it came up for a lot of different reasons. But one of the reasons that it came up was how much demand there was for SpaceX stock from institutional investors today versus what it looked like 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years ago, and sort of that evolution and what's going on. So I want to start off with a question that I've heard so many different times, and it's a bit of a layup for you. So we'll start there. But is SpaceX a monopoly?
It is SpaceX a monopoly. You say be a layup. My my knee jerk answer, my knee jerk answer is no. Although I realize in some ways the answer is yes. And and also I need to ask a clarification. Are we still talking launch or are we talking Starlink?
Great question. Great question. Just launch. Just talking about
Okay.
launch.
All right. So in the launch market, SpaceX does have a near monopoly on the industry, and it's really shocking the way it came about because it wasn't like they drove everyone else out of the market. Everybody else has just run into challenges and issues with fielding their next generation launch vehicles. And there was a really interesting change that happened right at the beginning of 2014, I'll say around 2014, right when I was starting to cover the industry full time, where Europe and Japan had made the decisions to begin next generation launch vehicles, the Ariane 6, the H3. You had the invasion by Russia into Crimea at the time, which triggered a overhaul of the Atlas V. RD-180 engine from Russia was no longer accepted, and so Vulcan was born. The idea for Vulcan was born, and all three of these vehicles were supposed to reach the market in 2020. And then I don't know when Blue Origin announced New Glenn. They were pretty quiet for a long time, and now they're much more open. But that vehicle also had this 2020 launch date. And so they were all beginning this evolutionary process to their next vehicle, while SpaceX was in the process of getting the Falcon 9 on the market. They did their first ever commercial launch for a private company in either late 2013 or early 2014 with SES. And at the time, they weren't really taken super seriously. I would say the big change that SpaceX did was they constantly iterated on their rocket. And then when they had perfected the Falcon 9, that allowed them to shift their focus to Starship, then BFR, now Starship, to improve on their own work. And so they're in a place where they have like a mature vehicle while they're working on their next gen one, and there's no shutdown time in between. Whereas some of these other players are running out of their legacy vehicles as they transition to these new ones that are now 3 going on 4 years behind schedule. And so what's happened is that's created this real deficit of supply on the launch side. You also had all of these launch startups. People love to say, "Oh, there's 100 or 150 or 200 people creating new rockets and things." That's higher than our number. I think the last figure that I have from our internal count was 88 launch startups, launch companies, and space agencies that were developing new vehicles. And so that's on the decline. But still, the vast majority of those never made it to the launch pad. Some of them are just getting there now. It's this litany of reasons. Each operator had a problem. And so the result is for an industry that typically likes to have at least 3 steady launch providers. And, I would define steady as launching at least 6 times a year. And that seems like a low bar now with SpaceX launching like twice a week, but launching at least that much. And, we kind of shrunk to, I don't know what the numbers are. We'll be tallying them soon because it's October. But, I think that's just 2. We've got Rocket Lab and SpaceX, and Rocket Lab's vehicle is considerably smaller. Electron is in a different class. So we have this bottleneck for launch, and it's one that I don't think anybody really could. I mean, I didn't see it coming.
Yeah, it's actually one of the most interesting dynamics. We went from, I think, a couple years ago, people saying there's so many launch startups, we have so much supply, right? That was like a lot of the rhetoric. But the reality, to your point, is, call it 180, 150, 200. There's a ton of different numbers out there about the number of launch startups out there. The reality is it's like the real number globally is like a tiny fraction of that, especially when you consider the amount of folks that actually have raised real capital and have an actual shot at becoming a business. But now all of a sudden you're looking at the market, and actually there's a complete lack of supply. And there's a new piece of news that broke just today that highlights that, which is Europe, right? And what's happening in Europe, and Europe turning to SpaceX. SpaceX just signed a deal to launch up to 4 of Europe's like premier navigation satellites into orbit, and that wasn't supposed to happen. I assure you, like you and I both know that was not ESA's plan.
People have been upset about this for a long time now. I mean, Europe is like the case in point, right? You had 3 rockets. You had triple redundancy, dissimilar redundancy, Ariane 5, Soyuz, Vega. And one by one, you run out of Ariane 5s. Russia's Soyuz gets taken off the market for geopolitical reasons. And, Vega is struggling with, with getting back to flight after some failures. And you just couldn't predict that kind of thing. So for Europe, especially, and for them, it's a crisis of sovereignty even. And the launch market is never a pure play commercial sector. It's always been one that's been driven, if not dominated, by the desires of governments to have autonomous access to space. And so you can look back at how European officials and Arianespace have talked about launch as them being Europe's surety of sovereign access to space. And for them to have to stand down and put their own version of GPS on a US rocket is an uncomfortable situation for sure.
To say the least. Do you think that there's a market for small to medium lift launch vehicles in a world of SpaceX domination?
I think there's a niche market for it. It's certainly not going to support however many dozens. I should probably stop saying dozens. I had Adam Gilmore tweeted at me the other day. He said, if you count, he gave me like a list of things. He was like, if you count who's got a hot fire engine or an engine hot fired and X number of dollars raised and some other things, it boils down to 15 companies. That's probably a much more realistic number. But even then, I think that small launch companies largely play a supplemental role in space access. And there's a lot of reasons, so I won't turn this into a TED talk here. But essentially, the cost, the idea, a lot of the genesis of these small vehicles, there's two of them. The first was that constellations. We saw all these constellations come up. SpaceX with Starlink and Greg Weiler with OneWeb. They both announced around 2014, 2015. And if you look at, we've charted when launch startups were formed. 2016, 2017, you see this huge surge in launch startup activity. These are a lot of companies that they saw these mega constellations coming. They also saw the CubeSat boom taking off and said satellites are getting smaller. We can make rockets that are right sized for them and provide this innovative solution for the market. The second was a conviction that these smaller rockets would actually be cheaper to build as well. And what we've learned is that small rockets still cost quite a bit to build and operate. It may launch a tenth the amount of a Falcon 9 or a heavy lift vehicle, but it's not a tenth the price. If anything, customers end up having to pay a premium for these small launch vehicles. And then that gets justified by saying, oh, we'll drop you off in a precise orbit. You don't have to worry about the ride share leaving you in the general neighborhood of where you want to be. We'll drop you off right at the house. It's probably a terrible metaphor, but I'm tired of the industry using taxis and buses. Just trying to think something else. So you had this, you had these two rationales, and you fast forward to 2023, neither of them have panned out. Small rockets end up still being expensive to build, expensive to fly, and your mega constellations have favored heavy lift vehicles, because if you are launching hundreds or thousands of satellites, what you want to do is actually fill out an orbital plane as quickly as possible. An orbital plane being a ring of satellites. So if you get a bunch of rings, then you build out your coverage and be global or near global, whatever your end goal is. It's just not economical to launch them one or two at a time and kind of pepper in orbit with these things. You might as well just launch 20 or 36 or 60 or whatever it is and complete each plane, and it's the economics work out much more favorably. So launch is hard. Launch has proven hard technologically, and I think it's also proven hard financially. And unfortunately, those lessons have been very slow to materialize.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And yeah, I mean, I think we've heard a number of those types of views on the show, and I agree with you that launch is definitely hard. So let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, Caleb, I do want to talk about the two areas of the market that you guys do spend a lot of time on, so remote sensing and SATCOM. So stay with us, and we'll be right back. Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. To quote the commander of the U.S. Space Force's Operations Command, Cyber threats are unfortunately the soft underbelly of our global space networks. SpiderOak, the leader in space cybersecurity software, is dedicated to providing space operators with the solutions they need to protect hybrid space systems. Their Orbit Secure software uses a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, allowing missions to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure LEO and hybrid space systems. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. So, Caleb, I want to talk about the remote sensing market. I know you spend quite a bit of time there. There has been the most obvious place to see some of the struggles of what's going on in the remote sensing markets is on the public side, right? So, companies like Planet and Black Sky, like you mentioned earlier. And I think one of the issues driving the struggle has been that commercial markets are taking a lot longer than expected to open up, right? Sales cycles have elongated. Planet actually cited that in their last earnings call. So I'm curious from your perspective, what are sort of the types of things that you're seeing in general in the remote sensing market, both on the supply and demand side?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are certainly seeing some conservatism, or people being a little bit more risk averse, like you mentioned with Planet, having some layoffs and looking at controlling their costs while they wait for the market to mature. I think the long-standing challenge for the Earth observation sector has been this build it and they will come mentality of if we just build these satellites, and especially if we build these satellites cheaper, then the market will come to us and it will be so much easier to make money. What operators have learned is there's this big technology gap, knowledge gap between taking an image and turning that into an insight, some sort of actionable intelligence. And this was a conversation that we've seen a lot on the Earth observation side, on the optical side, where it's the clearest. You can look at pictures and very familiar with looking at a picture and understanding how things have changed, whether you're seeing missile silos get built or a boat stuck in a canal for 11 days or however long it was. This gets even more complicated when you look at synthetic aperture radar data or hyperspectral imagery, these kinds of things where you need deeper knowledge of geospatial intelligence to look at an image or look at the data within an image and discern what's happening, what's changing in there. Not only do you have to discern the change, which means you need a specialist for that, but then you've got to go and say, is there a market for this bit of knowledge? So, looking at agriculture and vegetation as an example of one, you can use hyperspectral imagery to detect fossil fuel runoff. And, that's a super interesting insight. You can then use it to kind of detect, an algae bloom or something in a body of water. So first you have to get the satellites that can image that. You've got to build them, launch them, link them to the ground, keep all of those costs within reason. Then you've got to get your data science specialist who's going to work with all of that data and handle it, understand it, learn it. And then you've got to translate that over to a salesperson, and they've got to go and find somebody and sell it to them. And those people who they're selling it to, maybe they're scientists, but if you want it to be a big market, they need to not be just scientists. And so you end up with a lot of, this is the thread for the environmental aspect, and this can be the same thread for mining. This can be the same thread, and it can get really granular. It's like, we've discovered that this type of tree is affected by a pest, and we can detect that in the data. Well, how much time should we spend analyzing this particular species of tree? Is there actually going to be a market that justifies our use of time, especially if that time is backed by venture capital? Does it make sense? And so I think that's another longstanding challenge for the Earth observation sector. In some ways, it's gotten easier because of the advances we've seen with cloud computing, cloud data storage, AI ML. It's much easier today to store large troves of data and have algorithms figure out change detection much more quickly than just having people skim through it. So some of these processes have improved, but there's still a steep learning curve, and it's not simple for a lot of end users to make use of this data, which frankly is why I think you see so many of these operators reverting back to the government, especially the US government, as their core customer. You have a very intelligent customer that knows what it wants and has a large appetite for imagery, and maybe doesn't want you to figure out why they want an image or what they're doing with it. So that's like the easiest customer, so to speak, that you can sell to. But if you truly want there to be a commercial market, you've got to figure it out line by line, and that's much harder.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Specific to the commercial market. So do you think, because what you're saying is correct, which is like there's a ton of remote sensing companies that are now focused more on government than commercial, and maybe they were once focused on commercial. But and you and I can talk about the 10 to 20 plus use cases for remote sensing data that you can put on a pitch deck, right? There's so many. Now, practically how that translates to revenue dollars is a completely different question. Do you think that by the end of this decade, there is going to be a commercial market that will be big enough to support multiple remote sensing companies that are worth multiple billions of dollars? Because, by the way, if the answer there is no, then the industry's in for a world of hurt.
Do I think there's a commercial market? Do I think there's a commercial market that can support multiple players? Yes. Do I think that each of them will have multi-billion dollar valuations? And if we're talking purely about a valuation that's based on their commercial revenues, I would say no. I think if you're blending their commercial and their government revenues, I would say yes. There is still a meaningful government market. The US government especially has gotten very used to using commercial data, and as more countries get advanced in their knowledge of geospatial intelligence, they also find use for it. Sometimes that turns into sovereign systems, like what we're seeing with Poland and others. Sometimes that turns into virtual constellations, where you see operators like ICEYE selling satellites or Satellogic, this satellite as a service, where they'll build it and fly it, and then they basically paint the flag of whatever nation on it and treat that as like a quasi-sovereign capability. But I think it's too early to try and figure out where the industry is going to be at the end of the decade. As much as I wrote my crystal ball, I just can't see it. I think that the trends that have happened that are bigger than the industry, like what we were just talking about with cloud data storage and AI and these advanced analytics, these are the kinds of things that are making the remote sensing world really, really interesting, because I think this is what's lowering the cost of service, and this is what's making it a lot more feasible to just simplify the entire business. So I'm watching over the next, call it 24 months, to see what kind of disruptive impact that has on the future of the sector. I think those have been buzzwords for a long time, but they're becoming real now. So I want to see what they do.
Yeah, that's a good thought. All right, let's switch gears to the communications market. And I know an area that you know quite well. So let's start with Starlink, the other side of SpaceX's revenue dollars for the time being. I'm going to start off with a bit of a, maybe more of a controversial question, which is, do you think that Starlink's going to make the geo operators obsolete eventually?
Yeah, is Starlink a monopoly? Essentially. Do I think that they will make geo operators obsolete? I don't think so. Certainly not in the near term. Maybe in the long term. But right now, so having just got back last month from World Satellite Business Week, one of the things that surprised me was, talked to like half a dozen different regional satellite operators, and most of them described a shortage of capacity in their respective markets, not an oversupply. And that was wildly interesting to me because I'm thinking, well, Starlink is for going on 5,000 satellites right now. And we're clearly seeing they've risen to be the number one satellite internet service provider by number of subscribers. They're now at or past 2 million. The largest in the world prior to that was Hughes at about 1.2 million, followed by Viasat at about 600,000. So, number one and number two combined are now smaller than Starlink in the US market. But Starlink's penetration into the market is not worldwide yet. Uh, from what I gathered, it's still slowly getting into these various kind of more diverse geographies. And so I'm still waiting to see what it looks like. And this has also been a conversation that's taken place for years where these regional operators, they don't actually have the funds to build a low Earth orbit constellation. These cost billions of dollars, 5, 10, $20 billion to create. And so if they want to be competitive, they have to figure out how to either partner with or on LEO networks, or how to make their geostationary satellites much more competitive. And the arrow in their quiver right now is the software-defined satellite. The geo operators are really trying to push for spacecraft that are much higher bandwidth and are much more flexible, and where they put down capacity and basically make it so that they can provide a service that does compete on cost per bit, even if it can't necessarily compete on latency. And the industry still debates religiously how significant latency is. I won't offer a full answer, but I'll say that latency is important, and there's certainly use cases where you're going to want a low latency solution. I mean, if I'm playing Halo, I do not want the lag time of a geo satellite. But there are a lot, the vast majority of digital traffic is video, and video is not latency sensitive most of the time. If you're streaming Netflix and it takes 30 milliseconds versus half a second, it's not really going to be the end of the world. So you see, this is the kind of thing that operators are debating. And if they can come up with defensible, effective solutions from geo, I don't see it disappearing. I see them working really hard to make solutions that will ultimately result in a hybrid environment where you have this multi-orbit solution that makes more sense, especially if you are trying to uh, like improve the amount of capacity or bandwidth you have over a specific area. Say you're trying to serve Australia, for example, and you have your low Earth orbit constellation and you're starting to run out of capacity. Well, if you want to improve that with the LEO network, you can't just put up one satellite. You may have to add 100 more satellites or 400 more satellites or whatever it is, because it's all spread out pretty evenly. You can tweak it a little bit if you choose certain inclined orbits, polar orbits, or whatever. But if you want to increase the capacity there, it's spread out beyond the borders of Australia. Whereas you can put a single geostationary satellite up and cover the whole continent. So in some ways, this actually reminds me of an old debate. It's no longer relevant, but between satellite television and cable. And cable operators used to freak out because they said, what's it worth to us if or how smart is it for us to build all of this cable, connect all of these neighborhoods, connect all of these cities, spend, hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever it is, doing that, if somebody can just launch a single satellite and cover the entire continent. Like, one versus many is a difficult thing. Now, when the many provides a really, really compelling service, you still have competition. And what we saw with the TV side is you had both. Satellite TV didn't obviate the need for cable, and cable didn't eliminate the need for satellite. And I think we're going to see the same thing with low Earth orbit, with Starlink, and with geosynchronous orbit.
So I want to go back to the comment you made that you heard on the shortage of capacity. What do you think is driving that, or did you get any insight from where is that demand coming from?
Yeah, a couple of reasons. So one of them, frankly, is that I don't think Starlink has market access in some of those countries. And then even if they do, I think getting the logistics of getting the terminals to customers there can be challenging. Um, there's also a certain level of price sensitivity, and so we'll see how SpaceX chooses to price its service around the world. I think they're of course aware that they're going to have lower prices in some areas than others, but some of it is the inavailability of LEO constellations or LEO services. Um, the other is that satellite operators, especially these regional operators, have not been buying new satellites for several years now. So that moment, that inflection point that I mentioned around 2015, that spurred on all of these entrepreneurs to create small launch startups, also had a chilling effect on the number of geostationary satellites that are built. And in a typical year in the past, you get about 20 commercial geostationary satellites around the world. And, most of them will be built in the US or in Europe. Now you're ending up with about half of that per year. And even our numbers for this year, like we haven't fully tallied them, but this year is like the year of the small geo or the micro geo, where uh, yeah, it's approaching. I think we're getting close to 10 orders, but these are satellites that are a fraction of the size of the old ones. It doesn't even look the same anymore. And the result, not of these small geos, which are yet to launch, but of this multi-year deficit of orders, is that there's just not new capacity up there. So demand continues to grow. Each version of our phones uses slightly more data than the last one. Your browser, it updates, it uses slightly more than before. Demand is scaling even if you don't actually add new services. And then you also add new services and you add more people online and all these things. And what happens is that the old satellites can't keep up. So you're ending up with this supply demand imbalance that won't be there forever. But for the time being, while low Earth orbit constellations are not fully deployed or authorized, and geosatellite operators uh, lack new capacity, you end up with a dearth.
Yeah. So if you were to start, if I said to you, say, Caleb, hey, or maybe you said, hey, I'm leaving all this and I'm starting a company in this space. Would you rather build a Leo constellation, or would you rather focus on like a geo or micro geo type business model?
Oh, uh,
Knowing what you know about the business models, I know you spent a lot of time on these business models.
yeah. So for me, the full answer, I would do a small geo. And
Interesting. Okay.
my reasoning for that is because it's just a much smaller bet. I'm not a betting man. So if I was going to look at this and say the reason that operators are choosing small geos, and there's more than one reason, but a very big one is that the footprint of the satellite is meaningfully smaller than in the past. So if you want to provide service, you don't have to map out a business plan for an entire continent or half a continent for 15 years. That's an extrapolation that's really extraordinary and that this industry has to do on a regular basis. With a small geo, you constrain the market size to maybe a country or a handful of countries. Instead of serving all of Europe, maybe I just want to serve Germany. And instead of making a bet for 15 years, maybe I just want to make a bet for 10. And I think that I can meaningfully provide service to this market for 10 years, and then it'd be done. So I would probably make a business around that just because, not Germany specifically, but around a small geo where I would pick a market and I would say, here's where I know that there's going to be stable demand, where um, demand is consistently outstripping supply. We see this in maritime. I think you could argue that a big reason that Starlink partnered with SES to serve cruise ships is because cruise ships are like little floating towns, and it almost doesn't matter how many satellite dishes you put on them. They're always going to exceed the amount of bandwidth you can give them. So you could look at a market and say, all right, where are these deep concentrations of cruise ships? I'm going to put a small geo over that, and I can say with high confidence that this satellite will always be in business because somebody's going to need it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. With the last 5-10 minutes we have here, I want to talk a bit about policy and regulation. And I'm gonna keep it general and let you kind of take it however you think is most interesting. But in general, within the space industry, are there areas of the market where you think there should be more regulation, more guidance, more support, more policy from the industry, from the government, from the U.S. government to help support the space industry?
Areas where there should be more regulation. Um,
Or less regulation, or however you think.
yeah, I mean, there's certainly areas where I think there could be smarter regulation. So the two areas that come to mind for me mainly center around spectrum rights, and I am not as deep in the weeds on FCC files as I used to be, but I think it's not a secret in the industry that operators very frequently file for spectrum for their satellites outside of the US. And sometimes companies even inside the US may move spectrum filings outside the country. We saw this, for example, with OneWeb having redomiciled from the US over to London back in like 2017. That was done in part to protect their spectrum. They felt that it was better protected by the UK than by the US. And it's not an uncommon story. So I think if the US wants to ensure leadership in satellite communications, we already have these two behemoths and uh, Starlink and Kuiper, coming forward, but it would be smart still to make this an environment where if somebody decided, hey, I want to build a small geo and serve cruise ships in the Caribbean, that they base their operations in the US as opposed to having to set up an office in London or the Isle of Man or wherever you go, Papua New Guinea. That is something that could change. I also think that the US could be friendlier on um, spectrum licensing and perhaps allocations for gateway stations. The US is a land with uh, it's easy to access. You've got lots of fiber that's laid. It's big. There's plenty of spaces where you could put um, ground stations and gateways. And yet, I don't think that there is a huge amount. I don't see a huge amount of gateway development here compared to other parts of the world. And these are just gateways for downloading imagery from remote sensing constellations, or you put up gateways for telecommunications for these LEO constellations.
Caleb,
LEOs, and even
could you spend a second just defining what a gateway is?
yes. So a gateway is a site where you basically put up a big dish. Sometimes these look like golf balls. They'll put an antenna and then they'll put a dome over top of it to protect it from the weather. And that it can provide TT&C services. Uh, you can basically fly your satellite using this. You can download imagery or data. You can upload commands, and if you're a telecom system, then it's going to ensure that you actually get the maximum amount of throughput from your system. So you can build a satellite. Maybe your satellite has 20 gigs of capacity on it, but you're only going to get that full measure of capacity if you have a sufficient number of gateways that can support it all. So you can't have a constellation in space without a network of gateways on the ground that support it. Yeah, and from what I've heard from people in the industry, the US is not the easiest place to license a gateway.
Right. Well, fair enough. Caleb, we're running out of time here, so I have one last question for you, and we're going to take our space hats off for a second. And the question is, if you weren't doing research, if you weren't doing, focus on space industry, if you weren't in the space industry, I'll just keep it simple. What would you be doing? What would you spend your time on? What would be your job if it wasn't in the space industry?
Yeah. Does astronomy count as the space industry?
Astronomy, for the purposes of this question, astronomy counts.
Okay. If I wasn't here, I would probably be in one of the industries that's adjacent. So I do think that the telecommunications sector, its ability to bring people online, is a pretty transformative and life-changing capability. Maybe I would find myself somewhere in telecom. Maybe I would find myself somewhere on the environmental side of geospatial. And if I have to truly be removed from all of that, I'd probably just be like running my own brewery somewhere.
Running your own brewery.
Space team name.
It's funny. I have met in the last 3-4 months, I have met a handful of people who are into space, people who are really into beer, who are really into breweries, some who've actually built their own brewery. There's one down in Austin called Starbase Brewery, who actually
Nice.
sells to Starbase. And our own managing editor used to have her own beer podcast. So
No way.
there's a lot of interest in that. So if you ever do decide to pursue that, you'll have there's a lot of folks that you can call on, or at least get some ideas off of. So
I would have a brewery with a bunch of fish tanks in it. So I don't know what the theme of it would be. Some sort of Argonaut, nautical space. You got to have a helmet. I don't know.
Are you a big aquarium guy?
I love aquariums. I used to have one in my first job. All of my money went to a 25-gallon tank. Goldfish, but I would funnel all of my discretionary income into that, probably until I was at least 18. That's interesting. What's
your favorite fish? I got to ask that question.
It's still the goldfish, and so the ones that I liked are the ones where their eyes kind of poof out a little bit.
Yep. Yeah.
I know that's not. Those fish don't actually see as well. So it's not really the kindest thing that humanity has done in terms of genetic tweaking, but they just look real cute to me, and I don't know, they're just fun. They're bubbly, swim.
That's funny.
I enjoy them.
I didn't know that about you. I'm glad I asked. But Caleb, thanks for being on the show. It's a pleasure as always, and looking forward to having you back one of these days soon.
Yeah, anytime. This is great.